on this maiden voyage of the African American Men of Westchester and his partnership with the Westchester County Association. The program we're looking forward to bringing to you today is called Bridging the Black Economic Divide. And this is the first of many series that we're going to bring to you to share with you some history, to talk about solutions and how we as a people all together can make some systemic change in this country so that we all can benefit and do the work that we're all meant to do. Today, I would like to just say that first and foremost, as a member of the African American Men of Westchester, the African American Men of Westchester is a 501c3 organization, and the organization was created in 1987 by 23 gentlemen in Westchester County. And the purpose behind the program, this organization, was to bring about change within the Westchester County community as far as leadership, economic development, education, health, and everything else that affects the African American community, but not only the African American community, but also the Westchester community as a whole. So first, I would like to thank you for being here. I would like to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors for this program are Entergy, United Union Baptist Church, the Arthur S. Dixon Foundation, Mount Hope CDC, Con Edison, Arts Westchester, Benchmark Title, and the Westchester County Association. So again, I would like to thank all of our sponsors and thank you for being here. As we begin this program, I would like to just say that we have some outstanding speakers. And our outstanding speakers will share with you some great things about the history of what has happened throughout the past and what we can do in the present and the future to move things forward. So with that, I would like to introduce my co-host, Michael Romita from the Westchester County Association. And Michael is the new CEO of the Westchester County Association. Michael is also a former prosecutor with the Department of Justice and a business owner with the former oil company. I can't think of the name of the company now, but anyway, I'd like to thank Michael and his team for working with us and putting this program on. So Michael, I'll give it all to you.
Thanks, Tony. I just have a couple of opening remarks before turning it back over to you and the rest of this great panel. We are witnessing firsthand an extraordinary period. It's not just the recent events that have had a direct and devastating impact on people in the Black community. It's not like this kind of thing has just started happening. It's not like institutionalized and systemic racism is something new. It's real, it's tangible, and it is an ongoing stain on the American experience. Whether you're talking about the needless loss of Black lives at the hands of some in law enforcement, or the disparate effects of the pandemic on members of the Black and Latino communities, these things are symptoms. They are predictable outcomes of a deep underlying socioeconomic set of issues. And we in the Westchester professional community are not immune from the impacts of this real opportunity gap. If everyone in your professional sphere, everyone in your business peer group looks just like you, that is a problem. And it's not a very good way of doing business. So how do we help close the racial business divide? Promote programs and policies that advance opportunity and social justice for all. Make sure all people have similar access to professional and financial resources. Promote qualified people from different ethnic groups into influential positions and see what they can do. Connect with folks from different backgrounds and experiences. Now, as I turn things back over to Tony, on behalf of the Westchester County Association, our staff, our board, and our members, I want to thank the African American Men of Westchester for including us in this conference and for their continuing efforts to improve economic development and to impact positively the lives of all Westchester residents. I'm very excited to be a part of this program, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. Tony, take it from here.
Thank you, Michael. So I would like to introduce our MC and moderator for this program, Julian Phillips. Julian Phillips is not only one of my best buddies, but also he is a multi-Emmy Award winner. He runs, he's a marvelous cook, and he is just an awesome person. I would like to just introduce Julian, and Julian, you can take it from here.
Tony, thank you very much. And also, I think for Michael, I think that's Castle Oil that Tony did not mention. So I'm going to mention that for you. But this is a great thing for me. I just want to say quickly, thank you for the opportunity. You know, as a journalist, I've covered global politics, also economics. And of course, as a local news anchor, I've covered all the local news, crime stories and stuff like that. But there's an old expression that has been around for a long time. If it's not about the money, it's about the money. Economics supersedes almost everything. And when you're talking about racial justice in an area now, in an era of Black Lives Matter, if you do not have economic power, you have no power. You wonder why you have multi-million-dollar politicians that are running for office. Well, they're running for office because they want to make sure that they can control the laws that control the money. In this system and in this area and time right now, we have, and I know Sean and David, I'm going to introduce them in a second here, that the blacks control, or they have at least multi-billion dollars worth of power, but it doesn't stay in their hands. The thing about it is we have to find ways and means to make sure that money stays within the Black community. This doesn't come in and go out. They say in many communities it'll stay in and change hands 7 to 10 times before it goes out. And that does not happen necessarily in the Black communities. So this is very, very, very important. Perhaps the single most important factor that any of us can deal with at this time. So with that, I want to just say that we do have an all-star panel. And these are two gentlemen that all of you will know today if you don't know them. And they are also named that you will hear in the future because they're young, they're vibrant, and they have a lot of knowledge. Of course, one is Sean Rochester, the CEO of the Good Steward LLC, and of course, David Clooney, he's the executive director of the Black Economic Alliance. I just want to tell you briefly about them, and then we will open this up to questions and answers. I'll start off with some questions, and this is a very interactive thing, so questions will be coming in from all of our participants. And we want to make sure that you are actively involved in this great and lively discussion. Sean is the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, and CPR for the Soul, How to Give Yourself a 20% Raise, Eliminate Your Debt, and Leave an Inheritance for Your Children's Children. It's very important. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of Rochester and a Master's degree in Business Administration from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business with a focus in accounting, finance, and entrepreneurship. It's a mouthful, but it's just fantastic. David Clooney, the executive director of the Black Economic Alliance, is also equally adept. David has held a number of senior positions at the U.S. Department of Treasury under the Barack Obama administration, including executive secretary. More recently, he assumed management positions at J.P. Morgan Chase, the last of which was managing director, senior corporate responsibility engagement director. David earned a bachelor's degree at the New York State University of Albany and a Juris Doctor, JD degree at the Howard University School of Law. These two gentlemen are very distinguished. We're glad to have them. They both have presentations, and Sean Rochester, we want to start off with you. Sean.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. If you bear with me, I will share screen so you guys can see the presentation. Here we go. Again, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. You know, as was said, I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I talk about the economic discrimination against Black people, both past and present. Now, normally when people talk about discrimination, they tend to speak about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. I wanted to take a look at it from the perspective of what is the cost, and more importantly, what does research from the finest, institutions, universities in the country say that that cost is. I break the book into 3 parts. In the first part, I take a look at the cost of discrimination in markets that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people. That's the housing market, automotive, finance and insurance that underpin them, the job search, online commerce, capital raising for businesses, so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and really just quantify, very discriminatory practices that we may have heard of, but just put it in terms of what was the economic impact, right, up until the present. In the third part of the book, I take a look at where are we now from an economic perspective, and I introduce an economic framework that I call PhD. And PhD stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital within the Black community. Why is this of particular importance? It's because pre-COVID, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the broader, Black community. We're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees. Now, as you may know, there are about 2.56 million Black businesses, but only about 4% of them have any employees. That's roughly 109 or 10,000 of them. And that 4% generates about 70% of the total revenue for Black enterprise, which is about $100 billion, and employs about 1 million people. And we have 109,000 of those, but we're missing 1.4 million. And those two things, combined with the wealth gap, which is, in the many trillions of dollars, are driving the vast majority of the socioeconomic problems that we are all dealing with and trying to work on and work through. Now, this is vitally important because we need a lot of people at the table to work on these solutions. But here's the challenge, right? Effective problem solving is difficult if, one, the folks that you're working with don't see the problem, or two, they think you're the problem, right? If you would just fix you, then we would be great. Now, I'll share a couple of platitudes that we all may have heard, right? With you. One, which is, Black folks are simply not trying hard enough. That has more to do with not getting ahead than any kind of racial discrimination. You got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. You may have heard we have the same or better chance as anyone else, in particular white people in this country, to get ahead, right? Over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you may have heard that racism is an excuse. The failure is mine, but instead of me taking responsibility for my own actions, I spend all my time pointing the finger at other people. And the challenge, and over 7 in 10 Americans believe that. The challenge with that is if that's the background thinking and resonance, then that level of thinking ultimately will show up in the policy strategies and programs that often are put in place to address these issues. Now, what I want to do is I want to share a quote with you from Albert Einstein. He gave this in 1946 to the National Urban League. And he said, we must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, right, violence and economic discrimination, which by definition is the Black tax, will be made known to the people, right? The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken. So in the spirit of following guidance from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. Now, what I'll do in a brief time that we have together this morning is I really want to explore a little bit of how is it that after 400 years, over 40 million, Black Americans only own about 2% of U.S. wealth, right? Either we are consistently and colossally inept, or there's something else going on in the environment that we need to take a closer look at, right? So let's do that. So I want to take us back to the time of slavery. I won't talk about the horrors and so on and so forth associated with it, but I want to look at things from an economic perspective. And the first thing that we all need to know and understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on a person's labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours, not even you are yours. And during this period of time, there's many things that we could never, ever value, right? We could never value what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body for the entirety of your life. You could never value what it is to be a man, to be unable to protect your loved ones. But there are things that you can value, which is the labor extracted from millions of people over almost a 250-year period. And economists have taken a look at that. Some place the number as high as 24 trillion, others place it as high as 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is in the middle, then we're talking about up to $50 trillion worth of extraction from labor. But that's not the only thing that we can take a look at, right? If you go back to 1860, you've got 4 million people held in bondage, right? And you can actually value those people because they're traded on open markets. There's a price if you're old or young, able-bodied or lame, male or female. They're the most liquid assets in the country are these people. And it turns out that the value of these folks is so high that economists have to measure it in either in terms of a percentage of national wealth or in terms of GDP or national income. So the valuation of these people is between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or 1 to 2 years of GDP. So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, it's about $15.5 trillion. You know, how did you come up with that number? Well, you know, US wealth in 2016 was 85 trillion. If you look at 16 to 20% of that, that's 14 to 17 trillion. Take an average of those, you're at 15.5. If you look at it from an income perspective, 1 to 2 years of GDP, it's roughly $28.5 trillion. GDP was 19 trillion pre-COVID. 1 to 2 years is 19 to 38. Take an average of that, you're at 28.5. If you take an average of those two things, as we would do in any kind of valuation, you're at $22 trillion, right? And this number is corroborated again and again and again. Even if you go back to 1839, Henry Clay is in the U.S. Senate, talking about the valuation of people held in bondage. He places that number at $1.2 billion, right? If you look at the return on slave-related investments, which you can look at Thomas Piketty to get those numbers, it's between 6 and 8% per annum. If you use 5.5%, it's over $24 trillion. Even if you go back to the 1820s and we look at what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison say in terms of the value of people held in bondage during that period of time, they place that value at about 1 year of GDP, again, about $19 trillion in today's equivalent, or the sale of 1/3 of all land, public land in the nation. So at the end of the day, we're talking about really massive, hard to conceive numbers in terms of value and impact. So if we look at and think about, the impact of slavery, we're talking about over, $50 trillion. Now you can say, listen, while that is significant, it was also a long time ago. It's over 150 years ago, right? There's been plenty of time to accumulate wealth. Many people have come here, since then and have struggled and gone on to accumulate wealth. What has been the challenge here, right? But one of the things that we need to think about as we explore that is even the economic implication, right, of what I just kind of talked about. We mentioned that the value of 40 million people plus in the U.S. right now is about 1.5 trillion. The value of those people held in bondage was roughly 22 trillion. Which implies that 4 million people held in bondage over 150 years ago had 15 times more value to the country than 45 million people today, which is pretty substantial. So if you think about what happens post, slavery, people leave with no economic resources. If you go back to 1870, Black people own about 0.17% of U.S. wealth, effectively zero. There was a discussion about providing resources. We're all familiar with 40 acres and a mule. That actually never occurred, but there is a land distribution that happened associated with the Homestead Act. And one of the important things to think about is what would be the equivalent value of those things today, right? If we could value them. So if you got 4 million people held in bondage, 40 acres and a mule, if we set the mule aside, right, we're talking about 160 million acres, which is an extraordinary number. The value of land is roughly between 3,020 and 6,350. Again, these are farm acres. These are not Manhattan, Bay Area, South Beach type areas. Quick math puts that number at about $1.1 trillion on the high end, generating about $90 billion a year. That's what that would have been worth. And that seems like a really large number, but it's 2% of the 50 trillion that was extracted from them. That never occurred. But what did occur at the same time, if you go back to 1862, Congress passes the Homestead Act, and over the next 60 years, they distribute 246 million acres to 1.5 million white families. If you follow a similar math, that's the equivalent of $1.6 trillion in today's dollars on the high end, which is a little more than $1 million per family. Again, I'm all in for bootstraps and hard work, but $1 million is quite a bootstrap, right? How did it work? You had the opportunity to claim up to 160 acres of land. And if you were so fortunate to be able to do so, if you stayed on it for 5 years, you could take possession of it. Now, if you were an immigrant coming from Europe and you were so fortunate to be able to claim that land, in addition to taking possession of the land after 5 years, you could also become a citizen, because that's how long it took to naturalize at that time. So an extraordinary impact and giveaway. Research says there are about 93 million Americans that are direct beneficiaries of this giveaway. So it's not secondary, tertiary affected in some kind of way. And if we fast forward a little, you know, we talk about the Civil War has occurred, Southern economy is destroyed, global cotton market has really been devastated. The land confiscated in the South is returned to the planter class because it was confiscated as a result of their rebellion against the Union. And there's a massive demand for cheap, readily abundant labor. Now, a little more context around this. You know, cotton was the first truly global industry, right? It's the equivalent of what oil is today. There's 20 million people around the world employed in that at the time. A million of those folks lose their jobs. Raw cotton that are picked by these 4 million people held in bondage is 61% of US exports. It dominates 80% of the global cotton market, because you cannot beat, you know, free labor. And it leaves the world in a state that's called a global cotton famine, right? It affects India, Egypt, Europe, Japan, you know, the industrialized world at the time. And the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly free people back to work? Right. And the answer to that is this thing that we know of that's called Jim Crow, an amazingly non-descriptive categorization of a policy that was in place. But fundamentally what it was is a system of laws and customs that was reinforced with an extraordinarily high level of violence to reinstitute 100% tax on the sharecropper's labor. Now, I know that that sounds hyperbolic, and you're like, surely these people were poor, but 100% tax seems like really out of bounds. And what I'll do is I'll let you be the decider of whether or not it was 100% tax. So let's just talk a little bit about kind of, you know, what this thing was. And sharecropping fundamentally is a contract. What happened is those large mega farms were broken into smaller lots. Black families would agree to settle on those lots and plant cash crops. And at the end of the season, they would bring the crops to market and they would share in a portion of the crops, literally share cropping. But here is the challenge associated with that. Number one, all the terms and conditions of the contract were set by the white farmer, right? Some of those terms and conditions included a provision that said if you fell ill, they had the right to outsource your labor to someone else and charge you back for it. The other thing that we need to understand is that these folks left bondage with no economic resources, and that the harvest doesn't come tomorrow. It comes at the end of the year or the end of the season. And between now and then, that white farmer has to provide you with food and clothes and shelter and tools and seed and everything that you need to cultivate those crops and bring them to market. And they're doing it at rates of as high as 70% per year. So they effectively set your cost structure. The other thing that we need to understand is that when you take the crops to market, the white farmer is the market. He tells you what the crop is worth, which by definition means that he controls what your revenue is. And if someone controls your revenue and your cost structure, by definition, they control your profit. And you start to see what I mean by 100% tax, you know, on your labor. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's the same thing that I would be thinking. That is a horrible agreement and relationship. I would never agree to something like that. But here is the challenge with that. They have laws for that. And the laws, of vagrancy laws, state that if you cannot prove that you are a landowner or gainfully employed, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail, right? And if you said, well, I didn't see that coming, so I'll sign the contract. But on second thought, you know, I'm just not going to do it because it's still a bad deal. If you break that contract, they have laws for those, and they're called contract enforcement laws, which means that they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. And even if you decided to sit in jail and just kind of let things blow over, they have something for that, which is called convict leasing, which means they will lease you back out to the very white farmer that you did not want to work for or for a private corporation. And here's the thing that we all need to know and understand about convict leasing. There is one aspect of it that you could argue is even worse than slavery in this one aspect, which is while a slave owner will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive, right? So they would much rather have you around for another 10 or 15 or 20 years so they can maximize the return on their investment. Under convict leasing, that they have no such concern. They have no interest in your residual value. They're only interested in you during a period of time for which you are with them, 6 months, 8 months, 18 months, so on and so forth. And under those conditions, you have mortality rates approaching 50%. That's 1 in 2 chance of death under those conditions. Now, while that is draconian, it is also incredibly lucrative, right? So if you go back to 1914, about 20% of the state of Alabama's revenue is coming from convict leasing, right? Alone. Now, here's the thing. We always go through difficult and dark periods of time, and then kind of you get out to the other side of it. But this wasn't a bad 2, 3, or 4, or even 5-year period. This lasted for about 75 years, roughly from about 1870 to about 1945, during which time 4,000 Black people were lynched, publicly executed by their fellow Americans. It's the equivalent of 1 Black execution per year for 75 years. Nobody's been prosecuted, for those things, right? There is a testimony from a sharecropper in the Mississippi Delta. He said, I've been working these deltas for 30 years, and every year I know I've been robbed. But what can I do? If I speak up, I get cussed. If I raise up, I get shot. And that ends that, right? So I think you see what I mean by a 100% tax on your labor. And if that is the case, then it is slavery by definition, which is why this period is called slavery by another name, right? So if we think that during the period of legal actual slavery, which was about 250 years roughly, 50 trillion was extracted. And this lasted for another 75 years, roughly a third of it. And in 1860, you had 4 million Black people in the fields. In 1935, you still have almost 4 million Black people in the fields. You can argue that another $15 trillion was extracted during that period of time, from those people. So if you think about this, upon the Civil War and emancipation, that planter class lost about $22 trillion worth of value. But then over the next 60 years, they would proceed to claw back 15 trillion of that from those people and their descendants. Again, incredibly difficult to accumulate wealth, under these circumstances, right? Now, I won't be able to go through all of the detail associated with the maldistribution of resources for education, human capital development over that 90-year period of time. But I cover that in the book. It's well over $3 trillion. I won't be able to go into detail, right? Because from a time perspective on the housing market in space, but suffice it to say that between 1929 and 1969, less than 1% of all mortgages in the United States went to Black people. It's the greatest wealth building instrument that's ever occurred in human history. And it's extremely difficult for Black people in the United States to participate. There won't be enough time for me to go through the New Deal, which is equivalent of over in the GI Bill, $1.2 trillion of investment in today's dollars. Less than 2% of that goes to Black people and Black soldiers. And of course, the labor market discrimination is estimated to be 1.6 trillion in 1983. If you bring that forward to today's dollars, it's over $4 trillion of discrimination. And then there's the period from civil rights up until now. All of this I kind of cover in the book, but there's not enough time to go through it, at this point. So we can talk about, where are we right now? And the Black community is missing about $1.5 trillion in revenue. $1 trillion of that is associated with Black enterprise. 520 billion is associated with consumer income. We've talked about the massive wealth gap, which is actually way more than $8 trillion. And we've mentioned, the missing jobs and businesses pre-COVID, all of which has been exacerbated as a result of COVID. But one of the things that I saw doing the research for this book that kept coming up again and again and again was this issue, this notion of 2%, right? And it seemed like it was a 2% rule or paradigm, which is in areas that are really critical to wealth accumulation. For Black people, we tend to hover at a 2% participation rate. So if you think about total corporate supply chain spend, it's less than 2%, right, across the board with Black enterprise. I'm not talking about minority spend. If we talk about government supply chain spend at all levels with Black enterprise, it's less than 2%. If you talk about how much Black people are spending within our own ecosystems and our own businesses, again, it's around 2%. If we look at our participation rate in high growth, high compensation fields, we're well aware that it tends to hover around or less than 2%. And then, of course, in terms of providing liquidity for our businesses, through Black-owned financial institutions, Only about $4 out of every $10,000 in the US banking system is even in a Black bank. They have no capacity to actually provide the liquidity that's necessary for the business infrastructure associated with them. And SBA lending is clearly less than 2%. It's actually 1.6%. And all of this really places a really large negative depressive impact on job creation and business development in the Black community. Now, one of the things that I kind of want to end with is a conversation that I had when I gave my first talk at Google. And I got this great question, which was, we have a much better understanding of what the economic costs have been for Black people, but can you tell us a little bit about what the cost has been for the country, right? And I didn't have the answer at that time, but I said that I would think about it and come back to them. And I was fortunate to be invited back to speak on it. What if Black Americans have been allowed to fully participate in the innovation, right, that drove the economy? You know, so if we think about this period from 1870 to 1945, we're speaking about this kind of Jim Crow practice, but it's also one of the most important periods of the Industrial Revolution, right? During this period, 2.5 million patents are created that drive today's economy. You're talking about, your transistors, airplanes, the motion pictures, photocopiers, light bulbs, telephones, so on and so forth, things that we cannot do without. And of that 2.5 million, about 726 of those patents are attributed to Black people, almost a complete shutout of the innovation process. Now, why is this of particular importance, right? If we look at, Professor Kortoon from Yale, he says patents can be thought of as proportional improvements in productivity. A constant rate of new patents can generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is well demonstrable, right, in terms of economic data. If we look at what the Brookings Institute says, the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the innovation system, right, of people who might otherwise make or commercialize important discoveries. So one of the things that's really important that we all kind of know and understand is that talent, skill, capability follows a normal distribution or Gaussian spread. Fancy way of saying across all ethnicities, populations, so on and so forth, 70% of the people are roughly in the middle, 15% are substantially above average, 15% substantially below average. The question that I had was, if we looked at that population, I call it the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group, right? You said, if you looked at what is the size of that population during this timeline that we talked about previously, right? And what were those folks doing, right? How were they being employed? And that population size, if this is just the 15%, in 1870 is over 700,000 people. In 1900, it's about 1.3 million people. What are those folks doing? They're engaged in sharecropping, right? And in 1930, we're almost at 1.8 million people. Again, sharecropping, tenant farming, the vast majority. And then even at the time of 1950, just the ultra brilliant population, right, at 15% is 2.3 million roughly. What if those people have been fully allowed to engage in the innovation process? And what we would have seen is an incremental 280,000 patents, right, which would have driven another $2 trillion of revenue to national income. We see that McKinsey did a study saying if you close the wealth gap, it would generate another $1.5 trillion of GDP to the U.S. economy. And we would have seen over $9 trillion more of wealth for the nation, right? So Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, says that both the discriminator and the discriminated pay an economic price for discrimination, right? There's a cost to both parties. We talked about what the cost was to the Black people, but the cost to the nation has been exorbitant, right, as well. And then if you take a look at what a researcher from Michigan State said, is she posed an interesting question, which is, what if white Americans had experienced that level of trauma? What would have happened to innovation specifically, right? And her analysis said that 40% of the patents would have never been created. That's 1 million patents. Which one of those things can we afford to lose, right? The impact on GDP and national wealth would be well over 7 trillion in terms of GDP and 34 trillion in national wealth that would have never been created, right? So the cost of discrimination is actually extraordinarily high. So I want to kind of wrap things up with a quote from Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia. He gave an address to the United Nations back in 1963. He said the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, and it is with economics that these evils can be overcome. So with that said, I can just kind of pause there. We could talk a little bit about solutions, PhD economic framework, and that minority does not mean Black. So I'm gonna stop sharing and come back.
Yeah, Sean, I got to tell you, that was just an excellent presentation. You know, you wonder why slave owners didn't want Black people to learn to read and write. With that kind of information out there, it becomes rather scary. And also another question, because I have a ton of questions. We certainly want our participants to be involved with this discussion too. And I've heard this from white folks a lot. Why can't Black people exceed like we did? I think you laid out an excellent case as to why, with the black tax, Jim Crow, sharecropping, as just a fraction of the things that Black people had to deal with where they could not succeed. But we're going to have questions for you. But before we do that, we want to open it up to another gentleman, our distinguished panelist here, David Clooney, the Executive Director of the Black Economic Alliance. And he has a presentation. And after that, we're going to open this up for Q&A for everybody involved. So David, take it away.
Thanks, Julian. And Sean really laid out the context for this discussion extremely well, with a lot of the historical context of, answering the question of why can't, Black folks just pull themselves up by their bootstraps like we did for white folks. And a lot of it has to do with participation in the economy and generational wealth. And you really drew a lot of the examples of why we are where we are. So I'm going to, in 1 second, share my screen, but let me first just tell you who the Black Economic Alliance is and what perspective we come from. So just after the 2016 election, a group of Black CEOs, senior corporate executives came together in one of the many emergency meetings that I think followed the 2016 elections, and came together with a number of public officials, including Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Eric Holder, Deval Patrick, Susan Rice, Ron Kirk, and others, and essentially said, we are 80 of perhaps the most well-resourced and networked and powerful Black folks from the corporate sector. How can we use our collective power to significantly improve economic outcomes for Black folks? And they talked about a number of different things, including public policy, political action, and engagement with the private sector. And in 2018 stood up the organization, a 501c4 and 2 political action committees, raised a few $1 million in a short period of time, played in the 2018 elections, and then started a 501c3 soon thereafter to engage with the corporate sector. So the purpose of the organization is to elevate the discussion around what it means for the US economy to have full and better participation from Black folks. And it's not about charity for the Black community, it is about driving growth and sustainable growth for the entire US economy by empowering Black folks to participate in a way that we never have been able to before. And Sean touched on one of the statistics I was going to talk about, which is there's a 2019 McKinsey report that shows if you were to close the Black-white wealth gap, you could add between 4 to 6% $4 to 6% growth to US real GDP by 2028. And those are real numbers. And we're talking right now about how we're going to get through and recover from one of the worst economic crises we've ever seen. And this has to be a part of the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen and share a few numbers and statistics. And, a lot of us on this call know a lot of the things that we're talking about to be true from our lived experience. But there's something about seeing the numbers that helps illustrate it even better. So I'm going to make this here we go. So the median income, and this was all before the pandemic, by the way, for white families, $61,000, and for white folks, I'm sorry, $61,000 to $38,000 for Black folks. Median household wealth, again, before the pandemic, we were at 1/10 of the median household wealth for white families at $17,000 compared to $171,000. By the way, $17,000 is below the poverty line. Sean did a great job of talking about the cycle that I think has produced the outcomes that we've had. Housing has such a big part to play in this, and just to drill down on Sean's point a little bit, he talked about not really being able to get into detail about the New Deal, the GI Bill, but if you're talking about generational wealth and housing being the single largest driver of generational wealth and wealth among Americans over generations, when you, after the Great Depression, put in place a system of laws and policies meant to grow the economy and categorically and systematically cut out Black people from participation, like the National Housing Act did in 1934, creating the Federal Housing Administration and the FHA underwriting guidelines prohibited giving loans to Black borrowers that were, backed by the affordable home loans that were backed by the government. And then you think about the GI Bill as well, that included a number of, GI Bill was the largest kind of growth engine and driver of the middle class in America. And throughout the majority of that time, Black folks had limited opportunity to participate at both in the housing portions, a lot having to do with redlining, but then also from and there are local, state and local laws as well that prohibited, and even covenants that were written into deeds that kept Black folks out from home ownership. But then you also think about the educational side of the GI Bill, how many people are put in school who came home from serving their country, and Black folks were either denied for applying for the same benefits, or in a lot of cases, even if they received the benefits, schools were still segregated for a lot of that time in a large portion of the country, and in schools that would, on paper allow and admit Black folks did it at a significantly lower rate. So, a little bit about the cycle that home ownership and our lack of options in home ownership, have led us into, lower performing schools, which leads to lower performing jobs, which means you have a lower ability to save. And talking about generational wealth and the ability to start a business and save and create and pass on generational wealth. If you're always catching up, you don't have the opportunity to build and grow and pass it on, and so on. So moving on to the next slide. Some other numbers, again, we know a lot of this to be true, but some of these are just kind of stark when you see them. Like for every $100 of white wealth, Black families have $5.04. One of the ones that really hits me, and the limited home ownership, an interesting fact there is that you almost would expect this, that there's that kind of disparity between Black home ownership and white home ownership, but that gap is larger now and wider now than it was when the Fair Housing Act was put in place, and state-sponsored, government-sponsored discrimination was still legal. So that is a huge problem, and there are obviously other factors at play there. And one of the other facts that sticks out to me is that white high school dropouts garner more wealth than Black college graduates. And we think about education as a great equalizer, and especially answering the question of why can't Black folks pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Even folks who get through all the obstacles, get to college, graduate from college, still on average will amass less wealth than white high school dropouts. And obviously generational wealth and opportunity plays a huge role in that. So a little bit about BEA and putting together our focus, our substantive focus, and you'll see on the banner behind me.
David,
yeah.
I just want to interrupt you. Yeah, we're having technical difficulties. We can't see your screens. So we can go full screen to David and just have him talk this over, because he's giving the exact information you're going to see on the screens. Let's go full screen to David, and he can continue his presentation. In fact, actually, we have a screen up here now, David. The magic of technology, it's just backed up. So we can get that screen up there with David again in the background. Let's do that, and David can continue his presentation.
Can you see it now?
There we go. Yeah, we can see that. There you go. Okay,
great. Thank you for the heads up, and please stop me again if I'm talking to a blank screen or talking.
Well, yeah, it went to a blank screen again for some reason or other. I don't know why.
It just did now?
Yeah.
All right, we don't need the slides. We'll do it live. No slides.
Okay.
No slides necessary.
It's really okay. There you go.
I'll just talk over them. So, I was just going to get to BEA, how we narrow down on our focus on work, wages, and wealth. We did a number of things. When the organization was started, met with, had full day sessions with a number of the leading think tanks in DC, Demos, the Urban Institute, Center for American Progress, Brookings Institution, and others, and essentially said, present us or tell us your best thinking on how to close the wealth gap for Black folks. And work, wages, and wealth were the three things that kind of were the biggest drivers. Obviously, wealth is the catch-all category, and work and wages are avenues to get there to improve wealth building. But we also did focus groups and polling, particularly among Black voters, And the three things that were in the top three priorities were a good paying job, skills training, and building wealth. And the top, those were in the top three priorities, both for voting, but just the top three priority for wealth building as well. So a little bit about, where we are today. Sean talked a bit about the workforce, and one of the things we are very concerned about and focused on is offsetting the reality that so many Black workers are over-indexed in the jobs that already were going away to automation, that are low skill, low wage jobs with not a lot of security, that don't provide healthcare, and that are things that the pandemic has kind of shown a light on, that you either can't do remotely or that are the first things to go in a struggling economy. So creating opportunities to build really pipelines for Black workers to get into the growing industries like technology, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, and construction is a major focus of ours. And then a couple of, since I'm not sharing this, I won't talk through the policies. A couple of things that Sean mentioned that I want to highlight as well are, he talked about sharecropping and our lack of ability to control the market, control pricing, and really have any leverage to negotiate. And I compare that to the venture capital community now. The venture capital industry is over $250 billion, in 2018 numbers. I'm sure there are updated numbers that are even larger. And 1% of venture capital finance goes to Black CEOs and Black founders. And that is just woefully unacceptable. But I think similar example to sharecropping, Black folks don't own our ability to negotiate, to pass contracts to each other, to provide opportunities. And there's a huge gap between the resources and the people who are growing the industry and Black entrepreneurs who are trying to get a foothold and just even get an opportunity to be heard. So that's one of the many things the Black Economic Alliance is working on, creating more of a connection. And in fact, we're in the process of creating a Center for Black Entrepreneurship, which I know a number of different organizations are working on, but we're working with the venture capital community and have folks from some of the largest venture capital firms and even private equity firms at the table as we build these programs. And then we think about the buying power of the Black community. We have over $1 trillion in buying power. And I think it's been interesting to see this year how the business community has responded to the moment, to George Floyd, to the pandemic, and have been Black out loud in a way that we've never seen them before. But at the same time, I think you see even where a lot of the business community's heart is in the right place, their actions are still steeped in a very troubled and faulty foundation that is built on our history that Sean walked through so well. And one of the jobs we have to do is to change the conversation around what is the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion with particular respect to Black folks. And I think Sean's going to talk in a minute about how we've lost a little bit about, as we talk about diversity and inclusion, a lot of companies, particularly in the business sector and even in the government, have started to aggregate all people of color together, including white women, including anybody who does not identify as a straight white male. And I think we've lost, and we absolutely should, but I think we also need to disaggregate those numbers a little bit and talk about the particular experience of the Black community. And two examples I'll give, and then I look forward to getting into questions, is the financial services industry, which I come from. They've done a lot in the way of rhetoric, and they're talking about the right things and doing things like JP Morgan Chase just expanded its operating committee to add a member of the Latinx community and a Black woman, Tashonda Duckett, who is the CEO of Chase Consumer Banking, so that for the first time the firm has more people of color, more representation, more women around the table, which is absolutely the right thing. But at the same time, the same firm, and this is not a knock on JP Morgan Chase, and I'll move on to another example in a second. There were reports, and this is public, so I'm not breaking news here, that Chase Home Lending made in over 6 years on the south and west sides of Chicago, 16 approved 16 home loans to Black borrowers on the south and west sides of Chicago in 6 years. That is a huge problem. And you also look at a firm like Wells Fargo that recently they have a new CEO, Charlie Scharf, who I think is absolutely trying to do the right things. But there were reports that came out yesterday and today about comments he made during a meeting among employees, I think with their Black employees, saying that the Black talent just wasn't out there. And he said, I know people are going to get upset at me for saying this, but we're trying to do everything we can. There's just not enough talent out there, which obviously we all know not to be true. And Sean drew out in the numbers so well. So, a lot of this is about a paradigm shift, and there's really no silver bullet. There's no one thing, that we can do in, providing more down payments for home loans or increasing access to capital for small businesses. That all has to happen, but it is about systems change. And I look forward to getting into the conversation about the different things that are actionable now and what we need to be looking at and working toward in the longer term.
David Clooney, I want to thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to open it up because we also have some participants that have a question as well. But I want to open this up, and this is a general question both for you, Sean, and David, and you can both chime in on this. And Sean, you mentioned about the Black tax and gave us a great background on it. I guess the question I would have is, maybe it's a rhetorical question, but does the Black tax still exist today?
Yeah, so that's a great question because many people think like we're in a post-racial kind of state, right? And they're perturbed as to why are Black people so unhappy. So one of the things that I think is important to do is just look first at what the data says, right, about the levels of anti-Black bias, which are both conscious and unconscious. So if you go back to pretty large studies that were done, in 2012 by, Michigan, Chicago, Stanford, a bunch of different places, they placed the level of conscious bias, anti-Black bias, at about 51%, right, of the electorate, unconscious bias at about 56%, roughly 6 and 10. So you're talking about every other American, right? If you look at the research that was done by Harvard University, have done a ton of work in implicit bias or unconscious bias. You can actually go online and take an IAT test, implicit association test, but they find really clever and thoughtful ways to be able to tease out unconscious bias, right? And the data that they had, previously reported, and by the way, millions and millions and millions of people, Americans have taken this, was that, it was 75%, right, of the people who take the test had what they call the automatic white preference, right, which is a wonderful way of saying anti-Black bias, right, on an unconscious level. So the question becomes now, how does that manifest itself, right, in the marketplace, and to what extent does it do it, in ways that have an economic impact? And that's kind of what I talk about in kind of the first part of the book. So if you start to think about housing, it starts off rather innocuous, right? So you're going to be shown less homes, right? You're going to be told about less homes. So that's going to exacerbate and lengthen the time that you spend. But then, when you find a home and you start to think about applying for, a mortgage and applying to mortgage lending organizations, the treatment that you receive is as if your credit score is 71 points lower. Right. And that's a massive differential when it comes to your credit score. You're much more likely to be denied. Right. 61% more likely to be denied. Right. You are 2x more likely to receive an interest rate that's substantially above normal rates, about 150 basis points higher. Right. So when you think about that over a 30-year term, that becomes an extraordinary amount of money. And then you have the issue of equity appreciation over time, which is the higher the concentration of Black people within the community, you have up to an 18%, income for income differential in equity appreciation. Your house will be worth 18% less, all things included. I mean, that adds up, right, to over $300 billion of depressed value. And that's just the real estate space, right? We haven't even talked about how does that manifest itself in the automotive market, because on an annual basis, we spend more money acquiring cars than we do acquiring homes, right? As well as in the job search and in other places. And there are some studies that show that if you're doing online commerce and they can see that you're Black, it's a baseball card study by Yale University, that it'll lead to a 20% differential in the price of the card, which is kind of an absurd notion because it's a particular, it's a well-defined object, right? But the issue is what they do is they take pictures of the card and just hold the tips of the finger. So if the tip of the finger is visible, you can see the melanin content, and that triggers a 20% differential in pricing, right?
So I just want to cut you off for a second here. You make a very good point. Because nowadays, a lot of times when you fill out all sorts of forms, the census, whatever, you're applying for a loan, they want to know what color you are, what your ethnic background is. And you would think this would be for a good purpose. But perhaps, if I'm reading what you're saying correctly, it may not be.
Yeah, you're absolutely reading it correctly. Because remember, we're doing this on a well-established basis of high levels of anti-Black bias that needs a way for it to be triggered. Generally, that can be triggered by indications of Blackness. So it can be your name, the sound of your voice, it can be your phenotype, how our genes express ourselves, right, externally, or even the tips of your finger that give cues to it. This is well documented, right? There's no incremental benefit associated with being Black, but there are very, very, substantial costs associated with it in the present context across multiple areas, in industries. And that's really, really important that people understand that, especially policymakers and people who can allocate resources, right, within their institutions or corporations.
We have a lot of participants in this and viewers. I just want people know if they have questions, they can insert those questions on YouTube. And I want to give a question now from a participant, Kim Jacobs. And this can go, and David, either one of you can answer this question, but David, I want to pinpoint this question to you. Kim says, how do nonprofit business lenders underwrite loans that don't disadvantage Black applicants? Can you answer that question?
So say that one more time. How do nonprofit business lenders
underwrite loans that don't put Black applicants at a disadvantage?
So I think I would follow Sean's point about looking at the numbers. Look at the numbers of how nonprofit lenders have been treated previously in terms of the cost of capital, what interest rates they've paid, what standards have been applied to them versus standards that have been applied to their counterparts, and try to offset that. And I think, in talking about the Black tax, one of the things we need to do, it not only applies to folks from outside of our community, but folks inside of our community. I think, the paradigm shift is something that needs to happen for Black folks as well. We have been socialized the same way that our counterparts have to think that Black business and Black people are, less than, not as good. We've heard the term, the white man's ice is colder. In our own community, we will sometimes seek out businesses outside of our own community because we think they are better. So I think looking at the numbers and how those businesses have been treated, and also looking at the standards that are applied to approving and underwriting and setting, the cost for capital and finance is an important thing to do, and really start to reverse engineer where there have been, particular obstacles for Black folks.
I just want to mention also Kim Jacobs. I've been told he runs Community Capital, a very well-established organization here in the tri-state area. We're looking and we're waiting for some more questions to come in from our participants, but I want to run something by you, gentlemen. Before we talk about the PhD program that Sean has, Rochester, I want to talk about the Black Economic Empowerment Zones. It was much heralded in the last century. We are in the 21st century already, not so long ago, but as a small business owner, I tried to take advantage of that to much fanfare, and it netted absolutely zero. Now, we understand that the economic empowerment zones is a political imperative. My question to you guys is, how effective were the Black empowerment zones for small business owners to get capital to run an effective business?
So I'll answer first, and then I'll let Sean follow up. I think the intention, I think these programs can have good intentions. I think there's a lot of politics involved, and you've seen, Black economic empowerment zones, promise zones, now opportunity zones, and in a lot of cases, the benefit is not felt by the intended parties, who are underserved business owners who are looking for increased access to capital and increased access to opportunity to build wealth and to grow a business. So I think the purpose of these programs is right, and I think what we need to do is look at how we can put in place requirements that, in order to roll out programs like this and provide capital through them, there have to be certain guarantees that the benefit will go to the intended parties, which is Black business owners, Black communities, and I think a lot of that has gotten lost, and unfortunately, a lot of those programs have become, part of the problem instead of the solution, particularly around gentrification in neighborhoods that are turning around. So a lot of work to be done there. I think the purpose, among it depends on who you're asking. I think the purpose is in the right place, the intention is in the right place, but a lot needs to be done to make the programs more effective.
If I could be blunt, David, I think you have to take the politics out of it, and I think that's the biggest factor as far as I can see. I'm too old to lay back and say anything and sugarcoat what I believe to be the truth. The other thing is, in terms of getting loans, how effective, and I know there are not that many these days, of Black-owned banks out there. You have Carver here in New York trying to make a dent. Are they as proactive in trying to ensure that Black business owners can get loans through their banks?
So let me quickly answer that again, and I'll leave some space for Sean. The Black banks, so you have minority depository institutions and you have Black banks. Black banks, they're, I think the biggest challenge, so they provide an invaluable service, which is taking on, I think, a higher level of risk, making loans that a lot of traditional banks and larger banks would not, because they don't, see the kind of bottom line business benefit of it. And they are a higher risk for a number of reasons. So they provide an invaluable service as a means to get capital to business owners in need. I think one of the biggest challenges is capacity. There are roughly 21 Black-owned banks right now, and most of them have a small balance sheet, and they're not able to lend at scale the way that some of the larger national money center banks are. So we have been talking from a political perspective about trying to get more government funding to both Black banks, all minority depository institutions, and even CDFIs, community development financial institutions. So there are about 1,100 CDFIs, about 50 or so of them are Black-led, but those organizations are one of the primary drivers of capital and providers of capital to communities of color. And I think we need to look at that entire industry and continue to prop up Black banks by getting them more capital and more support and more liquidity, but they do have a capacity issue right now.
Okay, those are some good points. Again, I want to remind our viewers that they can leave questions in YouTube chat. Sean, this question for you. David mentioned, and you did as well, on terms of the steps in creating economic wealth and closing that gap for people of color, specifically Black people. Of course, when it's jobs, skills, and then building wealth. You talked about the PhD program. Explain that more in detail and how that will help, in your opinion, closing the economic divide.
Yeah, so PhD is the economic framework. It's called, purchase, hire, and deposit, right? In ways that create jobs, create and expand businesses, and provide capital in the Black community. It's the frame by which you judge the efficacy of a policy, program, or plan that's put in place. So at the end of the day, is it leading to job creation, business development, right, or creation or expansion, and is it providing capital, right, affordable in the Black community? So I'll kind of go through it really quickly and talk about some of the applications. So the P at an individual level is how we choose to spend our resources, right? That's our individual family purchasing power. That's aggregate the $1.2 trillion that was mentioned of Black spend. Very little of that, roughly 2%, is spent on our own, businesses in enterprise. So targeting more of that spend to high quality Black services and providers when possible, where possible, is a really, really powerful thing to do. Let me give you kind of like a concrete example. We spend we buy about 5 million cars a year, right? It's over $90 billion of economic spend. But very little of that is spent with Black auto dealers, right? You got 66 jobs, right, on average per location. These are really, really high quality jobs, right, from the front office all the way into the back office. And there's about 16,000 dealers pre-COVID. Only about 264 or 269 are Black owned, right? So there's a tremendous opportunity to create, jobs through buying cars from Black dealers, right? These are high quality spends. It's the second largest expenditure that we'll make outside of a home. And it's superior kind of, paying jobs. We don't need anybody's permission to do that. The follow up, maintenance spend is extraordinary. You could actually create hundreds of thousands of jobs associated with that. When you start to think about who do we choose if we're so blessed to be able to buy a home, right? Who's the realtor that we are working with, right? If you do some studies, I think it's back in 2016, we spent money on 177,000 homes. If you had used Black realtors associated with that, you would have to have 14,000 more realtors working 24 or 40 hours a week just to be able to process, all of those things. When we think about making adjustments to the home to actually kind of turn it into our home, right? Whether it may be finishing a basement or spiffing up the kitchen, so on and so forth. Are we using Black plumbers and contractors and, roofers and carpenters, so on and so forth? Really terrific jobs. They're going to be needed in the future, will never be outsourced. These are jobs that ripple through the families, right? And communities. We don't need anyone's permission to be able to do that. Those are actions that we can take, in and of ourselves. When you look at that from a corporation or institution, that's the supply chain, right? And Black businesses are woefully represented within the supply chain. So to what extent are we increasing the presence of Black enterprise within, corporate and institutional and government supply chains? You can create 50,000 jobs. People are wonderfully intentional in terms of showing solidarity, but don't just do that. When you have a $15 billion supply chain, make sure you're incorporating Black enterprise and Black businesses into that, and then use your internal financing companies to provide the working capital so that they can take on larger and more, larger projects. The H is just to what extent are people properly represented on payroll, right, at all level. And the D is deposits. To what extent are we and our institutions leveraging our balance sheet to put money into these very financial institutions that we're talking about? If you think about the Black population as a whole, right, we've got about $143 billion in deposits, right, liquid stuff. Very little of that is in Black banks. Black banks have about $4.7 billion, right? So just in shifting more of that to Black enterprise, and that has to be complemented by incremental investment, by the way, tier 1 and 2 capital, can allow those institutions to have the liquidity that they need. So if you start thinking about how does that apply, right? So when we start talking about things like opportunity zones and the like, what I've observed is these programs suffer from two issues. The first issue is they aren't actually large enough to address the issue, right? Just, out the gate, they're not big enough to fill the gap. The second piece of it is they actually aren't tuned to create jobs, business, and provide capital in Black community, and they're not designed to solve the very problem. They target low income areas, but they don't actually attack the issue of being low income, right? So an opportunity zone, which is supposed to be stimulative for job creation, is really all about real estate development, right? So that's just providing an opportunity for capital to come in and to transform the infrastructure of the place, right? That provides a better return on capital, but it doesn't actually upskill the talent in the place. So even if I do $1 billion project within a low income or impoverished or Black community, I'm going to have to import all the talent, right? There's no corresponding investment that goes along with upskilling the youth and the adults so that they can actually be part of the development and or operation of the enterprise. And that's why that PhD frame is so important. You can have nonprofits, they come into communities, they don't hire anyone in the community, they don't do business with anyone in the community. On average, the average profitability of a business is about 5%. Some are far more profitable. That means 95% of the total resources are being spent on raw materials and the transformation of those into products, the accounting, management, and the sale. It's all people. Right. So PhD is take me with you, represented in the payroll and the supply chain, and how you use your balance sheet to be able to provide liquidity that's necessary for all those things.
So that seems like an antidote, Sean, which is a good one. But I just want to go back to one thing again, because you were talking about the economic empowerment zones probably are somewhat flawed in terms of how they're executed. So if you have for instance, a community development financial institution, would you consider that an economic empowerment zone? And if not, how does that differ? And how does that differ from a banking financial institution?
They play different roles, right? So if you take a particular zone, I think what needs to happen is you need to have an overlay of these different, policies and plans and institutions working together, right? Because if the developer says, "Yep, Sean, I get it, 100%. I want to do exactly what you say," they're going to go looking for talent. It was low income to begin with because of all the historical issues that we're saying, right? Who is working on upskilling the talent that's there so that the developer or the operator of this entity now can be the offtake partner associated with it? So you don't have to just import talent from everywhere else and just shift, folks to a different space. How are you going to attract talent without having a proper school system, right? So that is vibrant. So to what extent are investments being made either into the existing public schools, or you bringing kind of charter schools, into those things? To what extent are CDFIs, right, community development financial institutions, being capitalized so they can provide liquidity to the individuals who are now earning more, right, within those areas? So you can actually overlay these things to have the impact, right, that we need, as opposed to operating them kind of in separately, right? And you lose all of the multiplier effect, which is something that I just see again and again and again.
David, you worked in government with the Obama administration, with the U.S. Department of Treasury, and I want to ask this question for you, and it's a very important one. And we've seen this over and over again. Even if you're not a small business person, you listen to the radio, you look at TV, and you'll see things in terms of minority vendor programs. Do we have enough of those? And how effective are these particular programs and getting people involved in corporations and small businesses where they can gain a foothold?
So no, we don't have enough of them. And I think we've seen marginal success, but Sean made a good point about the scale of the problem. I think we need to be thinking about how we are addressing the problems downstream or upstream in this case, in terms of getting people better prepared to compete for business, to capitalize their business, to even qualify for loans, to get business opportunities, to contract with larger contractors like the U.S. government, like state and local governments. And a lot of the work we've done around MWBE programs and things out of like the Minority Business Development Agency and the Department of Commerce and elsewhere have, I think, just begun to scratch the surface. And we absolutely need to put more into not only building on the foundation we have, which I think is faulty, but creating more training pipeline development systems so that we are creating more of an opportunity for people to qualify and scale up their businesses and not just add another $1 million to a grant program that has only had marginal success.
Good point. We got a question in here from Jan Fisher. This is to both of you. And it says here, how can the nonprofit sector be used as a vehicle to advance economic equity for Black people? David or Sean, you can answer that question.
Yeah, so I can jump in real quick. I'll be brief and allow David to speak on this as well. In the example that I gave, right, where we're talking about an opportunity zone, for example, that's already been tax incentivized to bring in capital to the area, you have the issue of the upskilling of the talent that needs to take place within that zone. Someone has to be able to do that, right? And they need to be able to be funded to be able to do that. That's a role that nonprofits can play. By the way, as you're investing in businesses need to be couched with advice and counsel, right? In terms of internal operations, how to think about structuring themselves, how to think about the supplier process in a larger organization. There's a tremendous amount of skill and knowledge, right? That's out there that actually needs to be operating as high quality consulting and wise counsel that complements these things and that has a direct economic impact, right, on the community. I think that's a powerful place where nonprofits can play a role.
One thing I want to interject here as we wait for some more questions, and obviously I have a ton of my own. There are a number of initiatives that have been put in place, as we've mentioned, economic empowerment zones, community institutions, such and the like, minority vendor programs. But there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room that we don't mention. And then, Sean, this is something that you touched upon earlier, but I want to go back to it. Because you can have all the programs in the world, but if we as a people do not embrace ourselves as important and viable assets to gain wealth, we'll never get anywhere. And what I mean by that is employing Black contractors, Black real estate brokers, using Black banks, Black businesses. And this is something that Earl Graves touched on a lot during his career, God rest his soul. The question I have to ask is, how do we get beyond the psychological scars of looking at ourselves as less than? And this may be above your pay grade. You guys are financial experts. You're not social scientists. But there's a question that we don't deal with as Black people, as people of color. How do we embrace ourselves to buy within our communities? And other people do this. Other groups do this all the time. We don't.
I'll
Go ahead, David.
Start by offering, I think changing the narrative is a big piece of this. We have seen and heard the same story, for generations. And a lot of people say you can't achieve what you can't see. And I think we need to highlight more examples of successful Black businesses, Black entrepreneurs, folks in spaces that make it more possible and real for us to touch and be tangible. But we also have to invest in actually doing it. I hate hearing the term, I'm going to take a chance on a Black business or take a chance on a Black candidate. We got to stop that. And you always take a chance on any business you invest with. So we need to start investing in our own community more and really changing the narrative and making it less the exception, more the rule, that you know of and are aware of numerous examples of successful Black businesses.
I guess there's a thing that you can get two people and you can get a person and say the sky is red when it's demonstrably blue, and they'll still see it as red as opposed to blue. We see that in politics all the time. And I guess what I'm trying to say, to both of you is that, it seems to be it's a hard thing to turn a ship around with a small rudder, to get people to think differently. And that goes into my next question, and it goes to home ownership. We understand redlining, we understand the difficulties of getting loans, but do you see any move towards people of color trying to get ownership as opposed to renting and things like that? Do you see that there's any effort or any initiative by Black people to move towards home ownership, which is a building block for wealth in this country?
Yeah, so let me, I'll take a stab at that, but I also just want to double back to the question that you had asked before, right? Because what you're talking about is really pursuing the American dream, right? Business enterprise and the like, but Black people were executed for pursuing the American dream. All of this desire is not something that's new to Black people, right? The greatest increase from illiterate to literate occurred after slavery. You know what I mean? There was immense value for education. It was deterministic, which is you cannot pursue that. You cannot do it here. It was not dependent on skill, capability, or anything. People were executed for opening businesses, right? Towns were undermined in the most violently conceivable ways, like literally burnt to the ground. That would have been whole cities that are thriving in magnificent ways here, right? So there is no failure of Black people to do anything, which is why the historical context, right, and narrative here is so important. So when we're talking about, what do we do from this point? There's a couple things, which goes back to what David said. There's no silver bullet, and there's no solution that's going to solve this tomorrow. It took 400 years to get here. In this place we call, the United States, and 576 years, right, in total since, the first, slave was taken to Europe, right? And it's going to take a multi-decade effort to really turn this ship around. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is a form of nation building within the nation. The great thing about it is that it has the ability and capacity to generate over $2 trillion more of GDP and almost $10 trillion more of incremental wealth when you make these levels of investment. So yeah, there are absolutely, Black people who are looking for home ownership, but your base is so different. There are Black people with phenomenal titles and great incomes, but income doesn't accumulate to wealth if your cost structure is much higher. And we don't have the benefit of intergenerational transfers, right? People are 5 times more likely to get an inheritance. When they do, it's 10 times larger than it is for Black people. And their inheritance, 91% of it goes to increasing wealth. Black inheritance is 1/5 as likely, it's 1/10 as much, and only 20% of it goes to wealth creation. And then in that context, we expect people to deliver the same outcomes. It's patently absurd on the face of it. We have to take a look at the environment and which is creating these outcomes, and not just looking at the outcome and marveling at why it is.
Understood. And education is a basic factor of that too. But I want to also go back to the minority vendor programs, or the lack thereof. How do we create more of these programs, and who do we look to create these things? Is it corporate America? Is it a nonprofit initiative that will kind of promote these kinds of things? Is it through our political realm? How do we affect change there?
I think this has to be an all hands on deck approach. And that's one of the things I've been encouraged by with the conversations, just the shift in the conversation this year about using the term systemic racism, starting there, where, previously you'd have to have, 100 exhibits and, 50 witnesses to put on the stand to say something was racist and to get, a receptive audience. And now I think we're starting from a different place, but also talking about what role everybody in society has to play, but particularly some of the most well-resourced and largest institutions in the private sector and the public sector and the nonprofit sector. So going back to one of your questions earlier, I think one of the ways that the nonprofit community can help is by leveraging their relationships with large corporations and with the business community. A lot of business leaders are literally looking for ways to use their resources, and they just don't know. They don't know the right neighborhoods to go to. Now, they might not agree with you if you tell them what neighborhoods to go to, and you have to meet in the middle somewhere. But I do think there is a significant role for the business community to play. There's a significant role for the government to play, and a significant role for the nonprofit sector. And I think when folks are rowing in the same direction and looking at scale and starting by identifying, how big is the problem and how can we all address it, instead of doing press releases and saying, we just gave $1 million and
Right.
with no real end in sight. I think that is a better conversation to be having, and that's how we're going to make some systemic change. But there's really a role for everybody to play.
We've gone through about an hour and a half. We could go on for the next, 800 hours talking about these kinds of things. But before we do that, I do have one more question for both of you. If you could briefly answer those, and then I'll turn the program back over to Tony and Michael. And it's specifically this, there are things, as you discussed, that Black people can do in terms of buying from one another, supporting Black businesses, those kinds of things. Those are things that only we can work on ourselves. But in terms of getting, say, for instance, minority vendor programs, corporations, nonprofits to get more involved, to me, the only kind of change comes through pressure. I'm not talking about violent pressure, of course, but I'm talking about ways you can put pressure on these groups to do the right thing, taking a Spike Lee movie term. How do you do that?
Well, I think it's one. I go back to this, this PhD economic framework, right? People have to know what your requirements are, what your expectations are, right? Which we expect that your payroll is going to reflect us. We expect that your supply chain is going to reflect us. We expect that you're going to use your balance sheet to the extent that you can to provide liquidity in our communities. And if you do that, we're with you all the way through. If you don't do that, then there's no point in subsidizing your own disenfranchisement. So don't do business with them. And at the end of the day, you're either good for business or you're bad for business, right? People can get very emotional about these types of things, but people are making, what they believe to be, economic optimizing decisions. And so we should spend according to our belief system, and we should encourage our, allies and whatnot to do the same, right? There's a lot of behavior that stops because somebody who's well-resourced says, I need you to stop, right? Or I'm not doing business with you. That order could be in jeopardy. right? We should be very clear on those things. We should be very clear with our politicians that we're looking for programs and policies that are stimulative to job creation and business development and providing liquidity within our communities, because it is not possible within a capitalist society to have thriving ecosystems with a gap of jobs, business, and capital. It is simply impossible. And that's what Black people have been dealing with for 153 years, since emancipation, and then, 200 years plus, before that. So that has to just be a base level of the conversation. And then we need to do the things that actually stimulate that. So when you get people who come alongside you and say, I want to do it, you have to have massive size, scope, and scale to be a supplier into a Fortune 200 company, right? We're not going to be able to grow our way out of this, right? So we're going to have to acquire. And where's that acquisition capital going to come from? Part of that needs to be a redistribution of pension assets, right? At an institutional level, from universities, from governments, from corporations, into the hands of, Black asset managers, right? So we can acquire companies to now supply into the supply chain. We need to think about incentives, right? To get people to want to do that. We can expand some programs that existed before. There was a minority certificate program that you guys may be familiar with. It applied to the communications industry. So if you bought like radio stations and TV stations and things like that, the seller got an economic benefit from selling to you. Because again, the Black tax is real and it's present, right? And decisions that are irrational, which is what by definition what bias is actually taking place. So how do you incent people? That program existed, I think, from 78 to 95. Put something like that in place and just expand it across, across industry. So you have the capital, and then you also have the incentive or the reward for the seller, and do a similar thing, with the corporation, and then pair that with and a massive investment in the educational infrastructure, because all these businesses, no matter what their size is, they need talent, right? And you can address the gap of people who are underutilized, but we need more people who are getting the right skills at the K through PhD level, right? And to complement all these efforts. And the final thing I'll say is, this is a multi-decade approach. If anybody's like, I want to do this tomorrow, it's not realistic, but if you're committed, this can absolutely be done.
David, I want to leave some room for you for brief closing remarks, sir.
Sure. So just to your question about how we effectively message to the people who need to make the change, I would just add to Sean's great points that we need to be strategic about how and through whom we're making these asks and these requests. As Sean put it, every organization and entity and official has people they listen to and people they're accountable to. So if you think about on the public side, obviously voters will not only hold people accountable, but I think we have more of an ability than we know to recruit and put forward candidates who represent our interests. They don't always have to look like us, but they do have to understand our issues. It's a lot of the work that the Black Economic Alliance does, is putting people in place who are smart and willing to get smarter on these issues and be champions for them. And on the private sector side, other groups have been very effective doing things like forming coalitions and activist investors to make proxy statements and get significant movement on ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance, particularly around the environment. Black folks would be wise to do the same and figure out how we own enough stock in different companies collectively to make asks about who's on their board of directors and who is in their senior leadership and what kind of lending they're doing to particular communities. So there are, I think, more levers to pull than we have traditionally before, and I think we need to be more strategic and coordinated in how we make these asks.
Okay, David Clooney and Sean Rochester, eye-opening discussions, names to be known. And I just want to also say again, this book, if you got to get it by Sean, it's The Black Tax, the Cost of Being Black in America, and CPR for the Soul, How to Give Yourself a 20% Raise, Eliminate Your Debt, and Leave an Inheritance for Your Children's Children. Good stuff. Both of you guys, fantastic. We got to do this again. And I just want to thank all of our participants. And I'm going to turn it right back over to Anthony Epps and Mike Romita. Thank you very much.
Anthony, I think you're on mute.
You're muted, Anthony.
Michael, take it over while Anthony's trying to unmute himself.
You got it, Julian. Thank you. This was really extraordinary. Sean, your training at Chicago Booth obviously brought the quantitative element in it into this in a way that's impossible to ignore. And David, your presentation, obviously, because of your experience in government, was well taken. Look, I got a lot of takeaways from this, but I'll try and limit it to a couple. The first is something that Sean brought up in his presentation, and that is that people talk about this opportunity gap all the time as being, something that works to the disadvantage of strictly to Blacks. And that's simply not the case. It's an opportunity gap that is broader than that, and is actually a lost opportunity for the entire economic community. That, what the economy has lost because Blacks have not been able to participate on an equal level is something that you can quantify and you've actually put into numbers. Discrimination exacts an economic cost on everybody, not just the Black community. The second issue is something that Julian discussed, and that's how, people often make this excuse about how, Blacks aren't working hard enough, or we did it, how come they can't do it? And you often hear something else, and that's that, they're taking jobs away from us. And you see that happening with, this immigration debate. And, let's just kind of blow a hole through that. Nobody owns the economy. It's a shared system. And to talk about the economy as being some zero-sum game, well, that's just some fallacious argument. The economy is there to benefit everybody, regardless of race, creed, or color. And if you're basically saying that there are only a limited number of jobs and opportunities, well, that's a pretty dark vision. And you're basically giving up on economic growth. And most people in business simply don't ascribe to that. And if they do, then their business isn't going to be around for very long. And the last thing I want to pick up is, and Julian, you said early on, I'm going to take the politics out of this. Well, I'm going to put the politics back into this just a little bit in a way that I hope is not controversial. And, I'll just mention two names, Jamal Bowman and Mondaire Jones. Now, whether you are Republican or Democratic, whether you supported these candidates in the primaries or not, you have two youngish Black men who are poised to take seats in the House of Representatives representing Westchester County. That's an issue that really shouldn't be overlooked, and they have an opportunity to make a long generational impact on all of the people who live and work in Westchester. And that's an encouraging sign. The Voting Rights Act was passed over 50 years ago, but we are still fighting in the courts battles over things like voter suppression. So whether you run a business or not, if you're just an ordinary person or normal folk who happens to be tuned in today, what you can do in the short term to help initiate change is two things. One, get out and exercise your right to vote. Show your value at the ballot box and make a plan. And the second thing is fill out your damn census if you haven't done it already, because those two things have a direct and pretty impactful result when it comes to advancing the whole economy, and again, regardless of race, creed, or color. So I think it was a fantastic presentation, and I was very happy to participate.
Well, and all I want to say now is I want to thank everyone for being on. I would like to thank our committee, Doug Dixon, Matt Carter. I'd like to thank Tom Grayman, Bernie Toms, Gloria Cunningham, Kim Winston, and Reverend Greg Robeson Smith. And I would like to thank each and every one of you. This is the first of many to come. Please stay tuned. We're going to have others, and this conversation will have to be expanded. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful and a blessed day.
Fantastic.
Thank you, guys.
This is great. This was great.